Welcome to welcome to chapter 11 of our textbook, Patterns in World History. Tonight, I'll be talking about innovations and adaptations in the Western Christian world, 600 to 1400. Now, when I teach the history of Western civilization, this is about, 4 chapters. But we're going to do it in one. So this is going to move very quickly. So I'll warn you right up front. We're going to be going through a whole lot of history very quickly. So let me get started. All right, we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, and the late Middle Ages. Now, it used to be an older style of history that used to call the first few hundred years of when we're going to talk about the Dark Ages. They were not the Dark Ages because there was insufficient light. It was called the Dark Ages by early historians because there were very few written sources. And of course, when dealing with primary sources, written sources have been privileged for a very long time as the best kind. But dealing with several hundred years of European history in which there's not a lot written down, at least not self-consciously written down about one's own time, you can kind of guess that the assumption that there isn't a lot happening at that time was made by early historians. But as my advisor always said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In more modern times, historians have found greater numbers of primary sources in artwork, in material culture, in anthropological studies, in archaeological studies, a whole host of new ways of reading history and reading those primary sources. And so we understand this era much better. My husband and I did a little program on what were the Dark Ages, and I'll share that link with you in the module. This wouldn't be a required watching, but just for your enlightenment. But when I'm talking about alternative primary sources or alternative sources to written sources, I'm talking about things like this piece of artwork. This is a unique piece of artwork called the Bayeux Tapestry because it was created in a nunnery in the Bayeux district of France. And it tells the story of an invasion of England that is going to change England's history rather drastically. But it is done as a long sequential piece of fabric that is embroidered. It wasn't a tapestry that is woven. It was a woven piece of fabric that was embroidered on. That's a kind of important differentiation, but it is approximately 18 inches tall and several hundred feet long, and it reads like a comic book spells out, and it even kind of looks like a comic book with all of the excitement of the battle and warfare and the killing of the king. This man here, Harold Rex, that's how we know who it is, and he is killed with an arrow shot into his eye. But that's the kind of alternative types of primary sources that we're going to have to get into in order to understand this time. And I'll be talking about a lot of stuff like this. So, with the Western Roman Empire starting to become weaker and weaker with the invasion of groups of people such as the Goths, the Visigoths, etc. There will be one group known as the Franks. They will be living in what we now know as France. That's where we get the term from. The Latin people, the Romans called it Gaul. So you can hear those two terms, Frankish and Gaulish, pretty much talking about the same people. However, as the power of the Western Roman Empire fades, it's time for new people to take up that mantle of leadership. And one of the earliest Frankish dynasties, the earliest kings of the Franks, king of France, in other words, was a man named Clovis. And his family name was Merovat, I believe. I could be wrong. But we call them the Merovingians. They will establish themselves on the throne of the Franks in 485 and then start gathering more people around them. They're going to be building their area up through warfare by taking other lands away from other people and extending their rule that way. Sometimes they will be aligning themselves with people, but mostly it's by conquering. They will also be an early kingdom to convert to Christianity. And this is the point at which Christianity in the Western Roman Empire, and now what we can call Western Europe, will start to become substantially different than Christianity back in the Byzantine Empire. And so it will be a religion where the language everyone will be using will be Latin. Writing in Latin, speaking in Latin, saying Mass in Latin. However, as far as speaking in Latin, not too many people actually hold conversations in Latin. All of these people have their own languages. Some are based on Latin. We call those Romance languages. Those are languages we would call Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, a few others. But there will be other language groups. There will be a Germanic language group. There will be a Slavic language group. There will be a Magyar language group. There will be a Scandinavian language group. There will even be a little bit of incursion of Greek, but not a lot. So what will start tying this area that we now know as Europe together, at least as an organized and unified being, is Latin Christianity, or as we will eventually call it, the Roman Catholic Church. And so to be Catholic or to be Christian at that time was to follow Latin Christianity or the Roman Catholic Church above any other religion or non-religion, etc. And the church is going to have a major influence in everyone's life. I'll talk about that in a little more. However, the church itself, with its hierarchical structure, did not have an army. It did not have a military. It had what we call soft power. Now, hard power, as you can well imagine, that's if you got a military and you can use violence and the threat of violence to get your way. The Roman Catholic Church did not have that. They had other means of persuasion um, at their beck and call. Things like withholding the sacraments, things like excommunication, taking one outside of communication with the church. And if you've got a church that everyone follows, if you are outside of that church, you are no longer in communication with your neighbors, etc. So the church will use this kind of soft power to ally itself with these early Merovingian dynasty. The Clovis will convert to Christianity in 498, ally himself with the Pope and the Bishop of Gaul. And here we see this marriage in that, and it's not a real marriage, just using it in a term of speech, in that you have a separate head of state, Clovis, the king of the Franks, and you have a spiritual leader in the Pope, who is elected from the bishops. And the bishops were the church leaders in certain regions, and they were over the priests. And so the dependency on the kings to have their lead legitimized by the church what becomes extraordinarily important. And in return, these leaders promise to use their power to extend Christianity to places where it is not and to support the Pope with money or with hard power if necessary. The Merovingian dynasty will last a while, but it will not be very unified, if only because by the inheritance tradition of the day during that time, when a father dies, he must leave all of his wealth to all of his sons. It has to be divided up. I'm not sure if it had to be divided up equally, but every son had to get an inheritance. And so they had to split off parts of land for those Merovingian kings who happened to die with multiple children, multiple sons. And so the Merovingian dynasty is going to hold on for a while, but we're going to see a group of people, how do I call them, deputies, who won't be in the royal succession, but who will be the guy underneath the royal succession. The power's going to go to that group. And those are the next dynasty. In the 8th century, we are going to see, first off, in the early part of the 8th century, one of these deputies known as Charles Martel, or a man who has the greatest nickname in history, I think, Charles the Hammer Martel, who will be a brilliant general and be very successful in fighting off various enemies of the Franks. And he will be rewarded as as the deputy with land, but he's still got a king over him. However, eventually, the descendants of Charles the Hammer Martel, Pepin, or Pepin the son, the short, will basically build up the case for making his family king. And eventually his son, Charles, or Charles the Great, or as the French call him, Charlemagne, will basically declare himself king. The Merovingian dynasty will have died out, and in comes a new dynasty, the Carolingian dynasty. And Charlemagne is a very smart politician. He is going to try to create a court and an empire that will rival their neighbors, the Byzantine Empire. And so he's going to do things like encourage people in the areas around him to become Christian so that he will get more support from the church. And there will be lots of groups of people, especially over here in the area we think of now as Eastern Germany, known as the Saxons. They will be polytheists, and Charlemagne will start taking over their land, capturing them, offering them the offer to convert, die, or be enslaved and sold into slavery. Now, Charlemagne didn't keep the slaves. The Europeans didn't keep the slaves. They sent them to Baghdad. They sold the slaves to the Abbasid dynasty for money, because the Carolingian dynasty was routinely short of money. So Charles is going to spread Christian traditions and build on some of the local traditions and try to bring back kind of the glory of what was a Roman Empire. He will take over a very large area of land and call it his empire. But he is seen by many of the nobles who he needs for their support, the Frankish nobles and a few others, as kind of an upstart, as not having that justification and legitimized rule that the Merovingian kings had with their relationship with the church. So Charles knows he has to fix that. And he has to make sure those nobles see him as a legitimate king. He also knew that these nobles would fall into fighting not just him, but each other. And so Charlemagne does what very smart kings do. When they know that the people that they rule are going to be constantly fighting each other, especially the nobility. And that is, he gives them someone else to attack. He basically starts pointing out areas. Let's go get the Saxons. Let's go get the Lombards. Let's go get these people. And he sends them off to fight battles, win new lands. Charlemagne hands out the new lands. That's one of my rules of surviving history. If you manage to take over land, start handing it out to the people who helped you get it, because that will make them loyal to you in your debt. Anyway, so Charlemagne has kind of a essence of he's not the real king over his head. And the Pope, Leo III, is going to take care of that. Leo is going to reward Charlemagne for his support of the church. Leo rewarded Charlemagne for multiple conversions, and Leo rewarded Charlemagne for uh, for basically military support. And Pope Leo III is going to show his gratefulness by crowning Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. He's going to do it on Christmas Day, 800, in which the Pope will show up for Christmas and hand Charlemagne a crown. Charlemagne acted quite surprised. He wasn't ready for this. Well, that's how one story went. Uh, it was a very savvy political move by the Pope, and it gave Charlemagne the legitimacy he desired. So now he's not just king of the Franks, he is the Holy Roman Emperor. Roman Emperor? Wait a minute. Wasn't the Roman Empire gone in Western Europe? Well, Charlemagne attempts to bring it back. He also tries to build up a court. He invites in noted scholars. He tried to make it a court filled with brilliant minds and art and literature. They will make a practice of copying lots of books so that they can get the knowledge out. In fact, they will create a new font called Carolingian minuscule that was faster to write with. They'll be doing things like punctuation, because the writing in Latin in that time rarely, probably almost never used any sort of punctuation. So to know when one sentence ended and the next one began was by guess and by golly. So punctuation, simple periods are going to make a huge difference in the capability of people learning to read. There's not going to be a lot of people who could read. Being literate was a skill that only a few had. Charlemagne himself was not literate. He did try to learn to sign his name. I have seen the signature. It is a very shaky X. People in their older people trying to learn to write it doesn't work all that well sometimes. But this cementing, this marriage of the church and the leadership of the Franks is going to make the church far more important in everybody's life. Charlemagne would also encourage the building of monasteries in rural areas so that the idea of Christianity and the idea of development would spread in areas that had very small populations. And monasteries were closed societies in rural areas that were sponsored by the church, where men and then later women could live in seclusion, ordered their entire lives, committed themselves to prayer, to chastity, to poverty. They had other vows as well. And they lived these very self-sufficient lives. But they will be a crucial player in the church and in society in general in Europe, mainly because most of the literate people in Europe, especially this very early medieval time, uh, the literate people were monks and nuns. That was the female equivalent. And so uh, this moving a monastery into a place would become kind of the basis for greater and greater development. In addition, by being tied to the emperor, the power of the papacy is going to increase too. And so we'll see the Pope as being an important political figure as well. So Charlemagne will conquer a very large area, areas we now think of as France and a little bit of what we now think of as Germany. His Renaissance is going to create uh, an interest in learning, as I spoke about it. And Charlemagne will be an important leader for the church, for preserving and spreading the church. So this is sadly going to fall apart within a couple of generations after Charlemagne. Remember how the Franks had a tradition which becomes law of if a father dies and has wealth, the wealth must be spread amongst the children. Well, one of Charlemagne's descendants is going to have three sons, Louis the German, Lothar, and Charles the Bald, an unfortunate nickname. Anyway, and the empire that Charlemagne worked so hard to unite falls into three pieces of empire. And one of the men, Lothar, dies soon after inheritance, and it leaves the two brothers to fight over the land that had been given to Lothar. And this is going to cascade into centuries of arguing over this land. Having an emperor is all well and good, but an emperor cannot be everywhere at once. An emperor needs people in regional offices. Charlemagne had some administration, but that is an administration that is imposed from above. And if your king is not that interested in it, or if your empire falls apart, that administration goes as well. And so some sort of regional development, of organization of power, of communities, of land needs to be put in place. And what happens in this place is known as the feudal system. The feudal system is both a economic organization and a legal organization in which you will have a lord of the manor. We use that term, the lord of the manor, because they will have all sorts of different titles: duke, earl, count, margrave, prince, etc. Lord of the manor strictly means a family that owns a large chunk of land. It could be a strong man, etc. So we use this kind of overall term, Lord of the Manor. So he is a person who owns a huge amount of land and wants to keep it in his family. But he also wants to make money off of it. And he also wants to feed himself. And he also needs to defend himself. And so this feudal system grows up around the lord of the manor, in which land is distributed in a particular way. And interestingly enough, labor is distributed in a particular way. Those people who work the land, we'll call them peasants, they will not own the land. That land is owned by the lord of the manor. They will work that land for 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 days a week for their lord of the manor, working on the fields that are held for the lord of the manor, growing what the lord of the manor wants them to grow. And they will work those fields for so many days a week. And then the other days are for themselves, where they can grow their own food. And this way, the lord of the manor doesn't have to pay them. He gets the proceeds from what's growing on the land, and the people who are working on the land feed and clothe and take care of themselves. It's not an enslavement of people. This system that grows up is a system that we like to think of as mutual dependency. Every person in this culture is dependent on every other person for something different. For example, a lord of the manor will often, along with developing the land, along with developing a village sometimes, will build a manor house. We call it a castle, for defense. And everyone in the region will depend on that castle for defense. Someone sees an enemy coming, a bell is rung, and everyone heads into the castle, hopefully to be safe. So the lord of the manor offers them protection, but he can't do all the fighting by himself. He needs a group of fighters to help him, because he doesn't want to arm the peasants. He wants them working, and he wants them capable of working. And so we see an entirely new class of fighter arise, and these are the knights. And the knight is a brand new class of people that happen during this feudal age. So the lord of the manor depends on the knight, but he doesn't want to pay him. And so he rewards these knights, or vassals, as they're called, with a fief, or a plot of land. And then that knight becomes the lord of the manor of his own plot of land. And he gets peasants, and he arranges for the peasants to do the work so many days a week. And then the money that he makes off of his land pays for his armor, pays for his sword, pays for his lance, pays for him doing nothing but training to fight day in, day out, and pays for those rather expensive horses. So the system, even though it grows up quite organically, plays out in all sorts of ways. I will go into greater detail showing you how this mutual dependency works in class. But understand that you've got these regional nobles, or lords of the manor. They have knights that fight for them, but never for pay, or not for pay at this moment. And there are peasants tied to the lord of the manor who do the work for the lord of the manor. After the disintegration of the Carolingian dynasty, we're going to see a new dynasty arose, the Capetian dynasty. The first of the Capetians will be a man named Hugh Capet, Capet, So they call his dynasty the Capetian dynasty. But the Capetian dynasty does not have the same kind of imperial ideas that Charlemagne had. And in fact, uh, the the Kingdom of France is going to shrink quite a bit under the Capetians. However, they will change how the state is organized. You'll still have the feudal system. However, the king will make sure to centralize the power in himself. So those lords of the manor are going to get a different office, and that's called the Estates General. And this is not quite a parliament. It will be built into a parliament, but the power in France will be centralized in the king, and he's going to tell the nobles what to do. And he's going to get them to do that by giving them land, by allowing them certain benefits, and allowing them to live tax-free. It's going to be a problem further on. And so the Capetian kings will be around for quite some time. The Capetians had good DNA. They lived to be very old men, generally speaking, and they were on the throne for very long times. And that kind of stability of dynasties allows for growth and allows for just an idea of well-being, that you're not changing kings, systems are not changing a lot. And so France, of all of the kingdoms areas in Europe, will pretty much develop into a extremely strong kingdom with an extremely strong king, and it will stay that way for centuries. However, England is going to be a completely different case. England had been a group of small regional lords who will be united in around 900 by Alfred the Great, the man considered the first true king of England. And he will try to follow in the footsteps of Charlemagne. He's not going to be that successful. However, England will be invaded by a man known as William the Bastard. I can say that because he was an illegitimate son of the King of Normandy. And being an illegitimate son and having older brothers, he was not going to inherit the land. And so he decided he's going to get his own land. So he gathers an army and invades England in 1066 and wins. That's the story of the Bayeux Tapestry that I showed you at the beginning of this chapter. So William gets a new nickname, William the Conqueror, and he basically turns England into his own kingdom. He brings in the feudal system, but he is very good about distributing land to the men who came to fight with him. But these men still have land back in France, back in Normandy, actually. And so their land in England is not as important as their land back in France, which was well developed, which had castles, which had the whole system was all worked out. Why change it? And so because there were a lot of absentee lords of the manor, William and his descendants are going to have to create a new type of state, a different type of state. And basically, his descendants, Henry I and then Henry II, are going to concentrate on creating a more legalistic system. See, the Lord of the Manor system, the feudal system, whoever was the Lord of the Manor was, for his region, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of his government. He made the laws. He carried them out. He was the law courts. And this is an okay system if it was, a knight having a disagreement with another knight about some boundary line. But if it was a peasant who felt that his lord of the manor had cheated him in some way, who did he go for justice? Where did he argue his case? He had to go to the lord of the manor. Well, that's not going to work out. And the Henry I and Henry II understood this quite well, and they set up legal systems. They set up traveling circuit judges. They set up juries of one's peers. They set up systems where every crime had to be investigated, reported and investigated, where a peasant could go get justice arguing in front of the court, not arguing with a guy he thought he had been cheated by and who had all the power over him. So Henry I and Henry II are going to put into place an extraordinarily strong administration that had its basis in legal systems, not power. We see less of might makes right, and we see more of the rule of law, in essence. Now, Henry II's son, he has an older son who becomes king at the death of Henry. His name is Richard. We call him Richard the Lionhearted. He will spend very little time in England. He will spend most of his reign on crusade. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. So his little brother, John, will be regent of England while Richard the Lionhearted is on crusade. If you are familiar with the Robin Hood stories, this is the moment of the Robin Hood stories. Now, they're myths, but some of the people in the stories are real. Robin is waiting for Richard the Lionhearted to return from the Crusades. Same guy. And the taxes and all of the evil things that are happening in England are being done by Prince John. Same guy. Unfortunately, Richard the Lionhearted dies on the way home from the Crusades. He's actually kidnapped. He's held for ransom, nearly breaks the bank of the treasury of England to ransom him, and then he dies on the way home. So now John is king, King John. And he is going to have massive struggles with his barons. For one thing, John is a hothead. And for another thing, the King of France knows him very well and is going to, there's no other word about it, troll him. He's going to write him letters saying, I deserve to have all this land, and which is John's land, and John will say no, and they will go to war. And they will go to war twice. And the King of France will pwn King John of England. John will lose these battles. And it's just not the battles. John will lose his families and England's claim to land on the continent. Normandy, Maine, Anjou, parts of Agincourt, thousands and thousands of acres will be lost. And many of these acres, many of this land belonged to John's barons, the nobles. Those were the families that had fought with William the Conqueror, and John lost their good land back in Normandy and France. This is going to upset them in no small way. And so consequently, they are going to force King John to sign a paper called the Great Charter, or as it's normally called, the Magna Carta, in 1215. And that Magna Carta is an important document that spells out not just the rights of the barons, but it limits the king. The king cannot raise taxes without talking to the barons. The king cannot call war without talking to the barons. This document, the Magna Carta, is the beginning of what will eventually become the constitutional monarchy. And England from that point on will be a constitutional monarchy, where a piece of paper, their constitution, they'll have others, will actually limit what the king can do and give much of the power, legislative power, and eventually power over the treasury to the barons, to the nobility. This group of barons will eventually become the House of Lords and Parliament, their version of the United States Congress. And so this is an important document in many ways, shaping the rule of law, etc. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with peasants. If you weren't a noble or King John, it didn't have anything to do with you. But this document is considered one of the important founding ideas of the rule of law. And in fact, on the 800th anniversary of the signing of it in 2015, an original copy was brought here to the United States, to Washington, D.C., and it was put in the ceremonial hall of the National Archives right next to the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. That's how important it was considered. It was really cool to look at. It had all these seals on it. It was very, very interesting to look at, but it is an important document, and it is why when we talk about England, we don't talk about a strong central king like we did in France. It's the opposite. It is a decentralized kingdom with the power, a lot of the power, going to the nobles. So it's very different than what had happened on the continent. And in the German lands. Holy cow. The area we now know as Germany and Switzerland and the northern parts of the Italian peninsula was not Germany. It was a collection of principalities, margraves, counties, dukedoms, earldoms, fiefdoms. There were hundreds of nobles and princes. All were the lords of their manor, and a few were kind of bigger kings. There was a king of Swabia and a king of Bavaria and a king of Prussia and a king of various places. But even though most of them, not all of them, but most of them shared a Germanic language, they did not share Germanic customs, and they did not share an organized kingdom known as Germany. That organized kingdom known as Germany will not come along until 1871. That is after the American Civil War. So Germany is stuck with this patchwork quilt of all these different kingdoms. And you can imagine it's extraordinarily violent and they're constantly fighting. However, the Pope and some very ambitious kings in the area will come up with an idea called the Holy Roman Empire. What? Again? Yes, again. A new Holy Roman Empire. Uh, and this person, the Holy Roman Emperor, will be basically a titular head of all of these different kingdoms and have his own land usually. But it is a title that's will go. It went back and forth between dynasties. At a time, it was elected. Uh, it's crazy. Um, and at times, the Holy Roman Emperor won't have any power at all. It'll just be a title. And other times, the Holy Roman Emperors were extremely powerful. Just depended on the time and the personality of the Holy Roman Emperor and if they were good politically and could organize all these fighting kingdoms underneath them. So don't let the solid colors fool you. So I want to move away from politics and get into economics. As I had mentioned, the idea of the feudal system was an economic system. It was a way to make sure sufficient food was grown, a way to organize labor, and a way to make sure that the hierarchy had enough to eat and everybody else too. But these areas that people were moving into were areas in some cases that had never been plowed, that literally had been lived on by nomads. And so agriculture had not taken a hold there. So, in order to feed everyone, they're going to have to get more food out of land that had never been plowed in a situation where the soil was completely different than other places. It was heavy, it was wet. And so, all new techniques, all sorts of technological advances, such as the heavy plow to cut through that heavy, wet soil, uh, getting oxen and horses all harnessed up and working together, as well as just hand implements like wheelbarrows and shovels and hoes and all this, and harrows and scythes. And I'll talk about those in class. And such techniques as 3-field crop rotation, which is a very brilliant way of handling crops by understanding that some crops suck the nutrition, the fertility out of soil, and that has to be replaced. And so figuring out how to do that without, having a Lowe's down the street where you can, toss some bags of fertilizer in the back of your SUV and go home and fertilize your lawn, they couldn't do that. They had to figure out what worked. And this is going to take recognizing patterns, keeping records, understanding what worked and what didn't, and trusting in those patterns. Because the 3-field crop rotation meant that you had to divide your land into 3 parts, and only 1/3 of your land in the course of a year was planted with your important cash crops. Another third of your land was planted with crops that were not as valuable, but you fed to your animals or you ate them. And one third of your land was kept empty. Uh, that is a difficult thing for a farmer to do because they want to maximize their yield. So these kind of um, systems are going to take a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation. And some of the most important people in this process were monks in monasteries because they too had to grow their own food. And so they, being literate, being interested in these systems, keeping records so they could see the patterns, they were some of the biggest innovators of these new techniques. And then these techniques would travel throughout the region. In this period, we will also see a great deal of trade, goods moving back and forth. It is not true that the people of the Middle Ages used nothing but barter systems. They did have money. It was in very short supply, however. And most of the things you wanted, the money was just too valuable to pay for it. So, yes, there was some barter, but it wasn't the only thing. And in fact, there would be need for banking as well as trade. And Europe is going to be taking advantage of the Mediterranean as the central point of a lot of these different trade routes coming together. The Trans-Sahara trade route that we had talked about a couple of chapters ago, where enslaved people and gold will be coming up, and this trade route will be heading back with European manufactured goods and salt. There will be an extensive amount of trade coming from India, and there will be extensive trade coming from China. And much of the things they traded were luxuries. Spices were a luxury. All those cinnamon, pepper, cardamom, a whole bunch of these herbs that we don't think of that much, all become extremely important. Herbs make, not herbs, but spices make a great trading commodity because they're dried, they're not going to spoil, etc. So, and they qualify as luxuries. So, all of these different routes are going to aid the growth of the European area. But we will see in towns, especially in Southern Europe, places like Genoa, Venice, they, because they're on the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, they will invest very heavily in trade, building ships, and most importantly, creating colonies to trade throughout the Mediterranean. And you can see Venetian territory, they had these green areas. Genoese territory, the city of Genoa is there. Their trading posts were here on the Black Sea. And one of the things that these trading entities did was to make all their ships the same. And then in their colonies, they would construct or leave spare parts for ships because stuff was always breaking on ships. And so any of the trade ships could pull in, switch out the broken mast for one that was sound and that fit right in, and they could be on their way very quickly. So, thinking like a manufacturer and creating replaceable parts is going to be a process that's going to help them a lot. And of course, this kind of idea leaked into everyday life elsewhere. So, one of the most important goods coming out of Europe was wool. Sheep, right, is where you get wool from, you shear the sheep. And of course, it needs a cold climate, or sheep are not going to develop really good wool. And so Europe had places that had plenty of cold climates. So sheep were a very big market, and woolen textiles, woven woolen textiles, were very important. That revival of Mediterranean trade is going to have what had patterns throughout North Africa and Central Africa, throughout the Middle East. And through the Middle East, it connected to India, it connected to the Spice Islands, Malacca, and it connected to China. So all of this trade is going to bring people more and more in contact with each other. And essentially, what we'll see slowly building is an early form of capitalism. It's basically someone brings goods to market and will haggle over prices. In some markets, the kings or the lords of the manor controlled trade, but in most markets, they didn't have the power to do that. Now, systems are going to grow up in the medieval system, in the medieval time, that are going to change that drastically. But we see a slow process to a market economy. However, everybody needs money. Everybody needs to borrow money. Everybody needs to borrow money to pay for castles or to pay for gear for their military, etc., which means people have to borrow money. Except that for some of this time, it was considered illegal by the church for Christians to loan money to other Christians with interest. You could give them a gift. You could loan money without interest. That's not a real big motivator. So, how do you get money loaned? Well, in many of these kingdoms were Jews. And by laws that had been built up in these kingdoms, Jews in places were not allowed to own land, were not allowed to farm land, were not allowed to hold certain jobs. It was an attempt to keep them out of this sphere of Christianity. But they came in very handy when it came to lending money because they could lend money. And they created networks of banks. And it meant that many, many people were in debt to those people that lend them the monies. It also made for a system that if say you were a merchant and you wanted to get a big load of salt, Salt was hugely important, not just that stuff on your dining room table. It was a preservative, and it was necessary for dyeing and other stuff. And one of the places that you could get it was the city of Salzburg in Austria. Uh, there's a salt mine in Salzburg. The whole city's built on top of it. And you could go to Salzburg, purchase a whole bunch of salt, barrels of salt, and take it home. Well, any bandit on the road who saw you taking your wagon to Salzburg full of empty barrels could probably guess where you were going, what you were doing, and that you needed money to buy salt, and maybe you had that money in your pocket. It was not safe. And so, with these Jewish banking networks, a merchant could go to their own end of the network, deposit money, and be given a note and take that, and not have to carry a lot of money, and get to Salzburg and hand the other end of the network the note and have cash, be given cash in the right denomination, because each area had different denominations. Um, so it was a system that was extraordinarily important. And because so many people were in debt to the Jews, this starts retaliation against them. It starts the mythos, the ugly, ugly mythos that we now call anti Semitism. That Jews are to blame for everything. Jews killed Jesus, so it's okay to harm the Jews. And some of this was economic. They owed money to them. So we see in the medieval period in Europe the growth of anti-Semitism. To the point that by the middle of the 13th century, most Jews by law were expelled from kingdoms in Europe. They had to go elsewhere, so they left. Or they converted, or they were executed in various horrible ways. And so this was a long-standing hatred, a long-standing distrust between the very small Jewish communities and the Christian communities. It didn't start with Adolf Hitler. It started in the medieval period. With feudalism and the Lord of the Manor system, fewer people were needed to grow food. And so people could do other things. And we see the growth of cities and urban centers and towns. And the cities were the places where craftsmen lived, where people with skills lived, and where the markets were. And it was the place where one exchanged goods or money for necessary things. It was where the lords of the manor would take their crops and sell them, so they would have the money, etc. But as feudalism lessens, because we see the growth of much larger kingdoms subsuming these little lords of the manor, feudalism is not practical in a money economy. The desire to have money to buy these things rather than simply spend one's life working for the Lord of the Manor for some intangibles does not afford you money to purchase the things you want. So urbanization and a money economy is now not going to be compatible with feudalism. Also, in the cities, we're going to see the rise of a lovely French word, the bourgeoisie. These are people who are not nobility, they are not peasants, they are not craftsmen and workers per se, but they are merchants, they are lawyers, they are physicians, they are eventually bankers and bookkeepers that have money, and they have money to invest. So they're not quite middle class. We don't see quite that yet, but this bourgeois class, it's called different things in different parts of Europe, confraternities. They are going to be the people ruling the cities. The lords of the manor don't. Cities were generally outside of that system or under contract to that system. So somebody had to rule them. So it will be these bourgeoisie classes or the confraternities. And they will basically set up rules and build the city and create infrastructure and put money into building walls, improving markets, building roads, and cathedrals. Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But people moving to the city, we see changes in labor. The men were very much working in crafts with the creation of the guild system. Men were apprenticed as young boys, would grow up with a master craftsman in their uh, skill set: blacksmith, wheel maker, cartwright, barrel maker, or cooper as they're called, miller, etc. And so the those that had these skill sets, who were masters at them and who were training, would have a large kind of extended family of apprentices who were growing up in the craft, and they would live in these homes. So homes had many, many people of different families and different generations in them. And so we see all sorts of changes in pattern. Once man became a master at a craft, like being a blacksmith, he would be busy working, and his wife would most likely be the one greeting the customers, selling the goods, being out in the market, being the uh, community face of the business. But they weren't always allowed to join the guilds. So they didn't have the skill sets. They had other things they did: weaving, um, housekeeping, doing the shopping, doing the cooking. Uh, Once, if a woman was elite, then they had a much more uh, cushioned life. They could hire a tutor to teach them how to read. They would learn all sorts of skills like embroidery, dressmaking, that sort of thing. Uh, but there would be a very strong division of labor in terms of skill sets and who got them. But women were not enclosed and shut away and never to be seen. They were busy in these small family businesses too. So they were a major part. They played a role in agriculture. Um, and there were areas where, if a woman was sufficiently interested in getting an education and having some agency in her own life, because most women did not run their homes. The man was always in the higher position. There were nunneries, convents, the female version of monasteries, where while they lived behind walls, they took vows of poverty and chastity and were supposed to be pious. They ran their own nunneries. There was no male interference usually. And so, in creating their own female spaces, they had agency in their lives, circumscribed as it was by their duties as nuns, but still, they educated themselves, they took responsibilities, they did all the planning and build and probably some of the building, but they had a much more free life to be responsible for their own lives in these nunneries as opposed to being outside in many places. The urban populations that we will see in the north of the Italian peninsula, we will see a very high density area here in England and in what we call the lowlands, which is Belgium and the northern part of France, of course, with Paris. And there is plenty of area in Europe that doesn't have a lot of settlement. I also want you to take a look down here because if you recall from last chapter, I believe it was, that the Umayyad Muslim dynasties are still in what we think of as Spain. And they had an extremely rich culture there, and they were an extremely urban culture. So, very high density there in these Muslim ruled areas as well. Excuse me. So, the church is going to have to expand with the expanding populations, the new demands uh, of the people and of the times, of the many larger, more powerful kingdoms. There will be an entire level of the church who will be political in nature, but there will also be people who will have a little bit more time in their life who will see the church as one of the major social organizing in their community, and they want to be part of it. And so we'll see a lot of enthusiasm for the church. And some people are wanting to go even further than just attending Mass, sometimes every day. Some people went to Mass every day, and Mass was held multiple times a day. For those people who wanted to devote their life to some sort uh, of a mission that they felt they were called to, there were more monastic orders, the Cluniac, the Cistercians, and the two newest ones that will happen during the High Middle Ages, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Each of these monastic orders will have new jobs. The Franciscans will be dealing with the poor. They will be one of the most, if not the most, popular monastic orders. They tended to be more urban. They were dealing with the poor in cities, and it is an extremely um, uh, popular movement. And it will be the Franciscans who are going to be moving out in many places. They are founded by a son of a wealthy man, Francis of Assisi, who would have a religious experience and want to start a monastery. And so he gets permission from the Pope, who allows him to open up a monastery. And then they open up branch monasteries because it is so popular. I will have, hopefully, if I get it done, a video on the monasteries, and you will be able to see the original Franciscan monastery. However, there's also the Dominicans. Now, these were monks who were very urban. They were dedicated to preaching, but they were also dedicated to getting rid of heresy, the ideas of people not thinking the way the church wanted them to. We will know them, or more familiar with them, with a different name, the name of what they did, and that was the Inquisition. They held trials known as auto da fes, in which they would seek out people who thought differently, who held different beliefs, who might be Jews or Muslims, who had converted to Christianity and were suspected, pardon me, of not being faithful Christians. So these different monastic movements had different jobs. They specialized in different things. We also will see in various popes a political move to make themselves independent from secular powers because, well, they didn't have an army. They didn't have ways to protect themselves. And so rather than having to lean on the kings and other leaders to help them and depend on the money, we're going to see a development of things like the Papal States, which was the land on the Italian peninsula around Rome that was basically turned the church into the lord of the manor in those areas. And so the church now depended upon agriculture and the growth to kind of have a base amount of money, but they still were asking for tithes, which meant 10% of one's income for the year, and other donations as well. And there's going to be even more money making ideas, but that's in a different chapter. So there will be plenty of controversies going around. One of the most, it's kind of hard to explain, but I think you can think of it as a political move. All throughout Europe, the church divided areas into regions, and over each region would be a bishop, also known as the princes of the church. Bishop was an office, and that bishop took care of the churches in the area, took care of the church business in the area. They were extraordinarily important people. They also had land. They also had, their own castles to deal with, etc. So they had a lot of responsibility on them. It was also an office that by tradition was not hereditary. So if a bishop died in a region, the Pope had to replace that bishop. But that's where the controversy came in, because the secular leaders of the area wanted the capability of naming bishops for their area. And that way the bishop could be tied by familial ties or friendships or just mutual understandings with the leadership in the area. And that goes around, that gets around the Pope's power. And this is known as the investiture controversy. And it will be bitter political battles and a few not so political battles between the church and local leaders. There's a whole bunch of things that happen with that, with local leaders saying, I got to have this bishop here. Now I'm going to put my buddy into that office. And the Pope is trying to get that power away from the local leaders, because the Pope's the guy who should be naming the bishops, because when the Pope dies, it is the bishops that get together in the College of Cardinals and they pick a new Pope. So that's why that position was so desirable, so powerful, and whoever had control over it had double control over the area. So if it was a secular leader, that secular leader putting his own friend in the office of bishops would all of a sudden have multiple powers. His power would multiply, in other words. And these struggles were extremely bitter in Germany. And it's, of course, in Germany where eventually we will see a split in the Roman Catholic Church. But that's not for another couple of hundred years. But the investiture controversy is still going on at that point. What about the lay people? And the lay people is the common person, the non-ordained people, and the people who are not monks and nuns. They are going to want to be part of the worship service, be part of their faith as well. But if they went to Mass, their Mass was spoken in Latin, a language that they might not even recognize or understand. And the laity, not lady, laity, or the lay people wanted to be a part of this. And we will see some very interesting growth in an interest in holy people, such as the Mary, the mother of Jesus of Nazareth, and an interest in relics, which are parts of holy people, an interest in pilgrimages, an interest in acting out biblical stories. We will see theater, which had been banned with the Roman Empire becoming Christian. Theater had been associated with the gladiatorial games and all that, and so theater was banned. But we will see growing in this time people wanting to act out scenes from the Bible as a way to participate. And so the very slow rebirth of theater comes at this point in people participating in reenacting stories from the Bible. Religious fervor itself is going to lead to the Crusades. And these are a very controversial moment in European history in which usually lords of the manor, sometimes heads of states and knights are going to go to uh, the Levant, this area on the easternmost part of the Mediterranean Sea, because the Seljuk Turks, which I talked about last chapter, had taken the area. And the um, emperor of the Byzantine Empire will ask for help fighting against the Seljuk Turks and will send a letter to the Pope in Rome asking for troops. And the Pope in Rome in 1095, November of 1095, will call a crusade where basically he will promise that anyone who goes on crusade, they called it taking up the cross, anyone who goes on crusade will be forgiven of their sins, past, present, and future in some cases. And so this just electrifies people all over Europe as a way, as adventure, as a way to get new land, as a symbol of their pious nature. For fighting men, it was a way to redeem their souls. It was a way to gain salvation, not by crawling around on their knees and asking for forgiveness, but doing what they were trained to do in a manly way, and that is kill. So you can see why this is even today, an extremely controversial movement, because the Crusaders, through the Pope, when the Pope Urban II calls for the crusade, he gives power, he gives them ideas about what they're going to do that were not at all what the emperor of the Byzantine Empire asked for. And so they're going to be traveling sometimes through the Byzantine Empire, sometimes they will be sailing in and violently taking many of these cities. And they will, in fact, get to Jerusalem and start a bloodbath and end up slaughtering everyone in the city, whether they are Seljuk Turk or Arab or Jew or Christian. Um, it's going to be a complete, total killing of thousands of people. And the First Crusade is kind of considered successful, but the other ones are held because the Crusaders from the First Crusade cannot hold Jerusalem. And there will be constant fighting for quite some time. But those are a little bit later crusades. Also, one of the things that becomes a central core idea of the Crusades is that Europe needs to be just for Christians. And so that means attention is going to be drawn to the Almoravid Empire, those Muslims who lived in Spain. And the kings and queens of Spain after this point will create the idea of reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain, to get rid of the Muslims who had been there since 711 CE, to kick them out of Spain. And this is going to create centuries of violence between the kings and queens of the various kingdoms in Spain. It's not one kingdom. It's Kingdom of Leon, Kingdom of Castile, Kingdom of Navarre, Kingdom of... there's multiple different kingdoms down there, and they're going to be fighting against each other almost as much as they're going to be fighting against the Muslims. So the Crusades spur a lot of controversy. One of the things that comes back after the crusade, because these people go down, the fighters go down, and then they come back, is a revived interest in some of the learning. Because the Abbasid dynasties, the Fatimid dynasties, and elsewhere, they will have continued the tradition of learning from the ancient Greeks, translating that into Arab, and then those works are going to be translated into Latin and travel back into Europe. So a whole group of scholars and scholarships is going to return to Europe from whence it had been ignored or forgotten. Also, there will be other areas of Islamic, thinking, especially mathematics, science, medicine. These things are going to be moving back into Europe. And one thing we will see created in Europe will be not just education, but the university system. And this will spur more and more people to become literate and to put into practice some of this new learning. However, it's going to come to a particularly horrible crash. And that is because the climate is going to change. From about 1000 CE until 1300 CE, there had been warming going on. And there will have been growth, agricultural growth in places that had not grown those crops before. So all of a sudden, for 300 years, we're seeing crops being grown in places where they had not been able to grow before because of this warming trend. Of course, they didn't have thermometers, so they didn't know it was actually warmer, but because we have the primary sources describing wine grapes being grown in England during this time, and they won't grow there now. They might grow there soon with our climate change, but they were growing wines in England. There was a whole range of crops that had spread north. And all of a sudden, in around 1300, the climate change comes back, changes back into a cold climate. Boom. And it happens very quickly. And it had been the case up until this time with this amazing amount of food being grown. Europe's population had tripled during this time. It also meant that every single bit of land that could be cultivated with their big cash crops of wine and wheat for bread, they had drained swamps, they had cut down forests, they had gotten rid of pasture lands. And then all of a sudden, the climate changes and everything's colder. And the growing season shortens, and there's unexpected freezes, and seeds that had germinated just fine in an area stopped germinating. The weather patterns change. And so food gets grown arithmetically. You can see a slow progression. Population grows geometrically. I mean, it's just it gets big very quickly, and all of a sudden, boom, famine. And famine, not in the case of mom, where's dinner? I'm so hungry, but not having sufficient nutrition for months. sometimes years. They wrote of a 7-year famine. And in those documents, they talk about uh, people on their hands and knees eating grass or chewing the bark off of trees just so they have bulk in their stomach so they won't feel so hungry. And of course, the the um, the famine, people who are going to be hurt most are the children. They will come down with diseases that humans get when we don't have proper nutrition, such as scurvy. That means not enough vitamin C, or rickets. It's a degenerative problems with your bones because of insufficient vitamin D, etc. So these cold temperatures and sudden fall of agriculture is going to hit those kids very, very hard. They will be sick as children, and they will grow up into adults with very weakened immune systems, if not totally weakened themselves. And this is setting the stage for something that we kind of associate with the Middle Ages, and that is the Black Death. And I realize as I'm recording this, we're all sitting at home in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have been home for a year. And that's very slight in comparison to what happened in the Black Death. Now we know when and where it started. There was a port on the Black Sea that had been a port for Genoese sailors. It was one of their colonies. And people in 1347 started dying mysteriously. And so a lot of the Genoese merchants and other people, naturally, they didn't want to have anything to do with this disease, and they suspected it was because of bad air, or as they called it, miasma. And so they were going to leave that area of bad air and jump in their boats and sail back home. And they make it to Sicily, and the disease spreads from that moment on. And so these bright red areas is where the disease hits in 1347. By 1352, which is 5 years later, it has spread throughout all of Europe and into Russia, Scandinavia, etc. Now, they did not know what it was, but it was frightening in a way that I think we have some thoughts, but we also know scientifically what causes these. So the bubonic plague, we call it the Black Death. It's actually called the bubonic plague. It was spreads via Genoese merchant ships in 1347. The bubonic plague is a microbe that infests fleas that live on rats. And sometimes when those rats and humans come into close contact, like on every ship in the world, or urban areas, etc., the fleas jump off, the microbes spread. People wore heavy clothing, lots layers of clothing to keep themselves warm because of no central heating or air conditioning. And so having fleas was, it would have been a very difficult thing to keep fleas off of you. People were often in contact with livestock. Now, it is not true that the people of the Middle Ages did not bathe. They did bathe quite regularly, and they were very keen to keep themselves clean. But keeping clothes clean was a different problem. And so getting a flea bite was something that they never noticed. Or would rarely notice. And they certainly didn't think of the fleas as causing the disease. So, if an infected flea, bites someone, that gets into the lymph system. And it starts swelling up the lymph nodes. The lymph nodes in your throat, right underneath your jaw, the lymph nodes underneath your arm, and the lymph nodes in your groin. These, with the bubonic plague, would swell up to the size of oranges, apples. I mean, they were huge, and they turned black. They were horrible stretching of skin. They were extremely painful. One had a high fever, was constantly thirsty, and that was the swellings were called buboes, which is why we call it the bubonic plague. But that was only one way it traveled. So the bubonic version, the version where your lymph nodes are endangered, that if you were struck with it, it killed you within 3 days. There was no penicillin, no nothing. But that wasn't the only way it traveled. There was a septicemic version of it. That means bloodborne, which means that you might have gotten blood from someone who suffered from the bubonic plague on your hands in a cut somewhere. That went into your blood system. That could kill you within 24 hours to 2 days. The third way it traveled, and the one that was most frightening, was pneumonically, by breathing. You could pass it with your saliva, just like COVID-19, which is why we're all wearing masks when we go outside. Well, it was the same thing with the bubonic plague, although people didn't realize that. But there were written reports of people being perfectly healthy when they went out to their fields to work in the morning and never coming home, that they would be breathe it in and it would kill them within 8 hours. So it was horribly frightening. It panicked entire villages. People would hear somebody coughing and run. This is a problem at that time because everyone heated their homes and cooked their food over wooden fires. And if you've ever been camping for a long time, or if you've ever been in a situation where you heated your home or cooked over a wood fire, there's a lot of particulate matter. You're coughing all the time. You're coughing a lot. And so consequently, some people panicked over nothing. At the first signs of buboes, sometimes the entire family would just leave the stricken family member behind, leave the house, nail the door shut so that the infected person cannot get out and infect everybody else, and go somewhere else, which they might be vectors. They might be spreading it too. So that wasn't very, helpful. So about 1/2 of the population of Europe will get the disease, and approximately 1/3 of the population will die of that. So millions of people. The death toll was staggering, and it took a huge toll on the population. However, once it went through, and the disease would go through a town and it would disappear, and it might come back 20 years later and then it would disappear. It was very mysterious, but it was kicking around Europe for 300 years. So thankfully it's gone. No, it's not. Actually, the bubonic plague, you can catch it today. About a dozen people in America catch it every year. It is a microbe still. Yersinia pestis is the microbe. It lives on infected fleas, just as it did in the Middle Ages. And those fleas live on chipmunks on the western side of the Rocky Mountains. So if you go to Yosemite, or if you go to Nevada or Oregon or Washington and you spend a lovely camping trip or are outside in those areas, do not play with the chipmunks. Just don't. Anyway, because as I said, now we can cure it. As long as you get to a hospital in time and whatever ER physician actually realizes what is going on. We don't get deaths anymore, but still. When a third of the population goes, that broke the demand on the food. So there was less demand for consumer goods and for grain. And so a new balance happened in growing. All those areas, the forests that they had cleared off to grow more wheat, they didn't need that anymore. The forests came back. The pasture land that they had planted in wheat, they didn't need that. So it became pasture land. People put sheep back on it, or goats, or cow. So the diet changed drastically for people. There was enough for people after this, but there had been a huge amount of social tensions. There had been finger pointing. Of course, there had been several pogroms to kill Jews. The few Jews that were left, a lot of them are killed, blamed on it, and are killed. But because the disease spared no one, not peasants died of it, old people died of it, young people died of it, kings died of it, nobles died of it, priests died of it, at least one pope died of it. It is going to change society because the relationship between people is going to change. They made it through. They still didn't know exactly what happened, but the questions are going to be there. And eventually, what is going to grow out of it is people are going to start gaining a little bit better lifestyle. I mean, the peasants, very poor people, are going to, because there's sufficient food now, because there are fewer people. When you get fewer people to do a job, what happens to the salary? It goes up. And so there will be a set of revolts that will start after the bubonic plague. The first one will be the Jacquerie in France. It's called the Jacquerie. The joke is because the people, the noblemen who fought against these peasants assumed that every French peasant was named Jacques. But they will be workers who will want better wages. They will have a brief revolt. They'll want more say in the running of the cities. They will be put down violently. There will be another group in the city of Florence known as the Ch11. These are the silk and other weavers, highly specialized, highly skilled job. They will try to take over the government. They actually succeed for a few months before they are brutally put down. And then the big one, Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, in which a million peasants gather, and approximately a million peasants. When they talk about numbers, it's very difficult to figure it out, but it was huge. They get to London and they want better pay. They want better prices for the goods they want to sell. They don't want the government uh, in the cities or the king telling them how much they can sell their goods for. It is sadly put down very violently as well. But with these movements, there is now a bigger understanding in society that these people need a place in society as well. Um, Maybe those nobles and the kings aren't necessarily better people, in other words, because they died just as readily as everyone else. So it's not that these, it's important to know that these revolts don't happen when everyone is at the very bottom. They happen as things are starting to get a little bit better, and this idea of we want more happens. So these are very, very just basic beginnings of things like labor movements. However, Europeans don't do themselves any favors during this time because there was a major war going on during the entire course of the Black Death. And that was the Hundred Years' War, which actually lasted a little bit longer than 100 years, but it starts in 1337 when the King of England, Edward III, tries to claim the French throne. And so it is a war between England and France. It is going to have major battles. We will have people involved in it, like Joan of Arc for France, and um, the British longbowmen, and it's to try to think and know all of these battles is beyond the scope of this course. Just understand that, number one, this is all going on during a plague and a little bit after a famine. And so you've got a whole bunch of people fighting who could be growing things. You've got marching armies that are going to spread the disease. It is a mess. Also, the politics are interesting because the French and the British are going to be arguing over who is Pope and where does the Pope live. There had been a crisis in the church in Rome of the there will be violence against the Pope because there will be rival families who want their members to be elected as Pope. There will be clashes with the Pope in Rome and the King of France over the King of France wants to put taxes on the clergy. on the whole investiture controversy. The King of France wants to put his people in place as bishops. And it will come to a head in 1305 when we will have had a pope. One pope will be killed by a mob. Another pope will be threatened. And so, starting with Clement V, Pope Clement V, he will be trying to find the very safest place on the Italian peninsula to move the church, the administration. And the safest places he finds is not the Italian peninsula. It is Avignon, France. Beautiful town in the south of France. And moves into this castle, which is a palace at Avignon. And for another 70 years, the popes and the administration will live in France, not on the Italian peninsula, not in Rome. And this is going to mean that the popes and the bishops in France are going to be naming Frenchmen to offices. They're going to be electing French popes. The administration is French. In order to move and to provide protection, the Pope is going to ask for more and more money to try to, make up the difference. And it's going to seem as if the French popes have got direct power and contact with the King of France, which they obviously do. So there's suspicion in that direction. And of course, this is in the middle of the 100 Years' War. And so there will be alliances between many areas in the European area with France. And there will be areas outside who will ally with England. So Europe is divided during the middle of this 100 Years' War, with part of Europe siding with France and the other part of Europe siding with England. Now, in 1378, this is all going to get worse. Right, it's going to get worse. Yes, it's going to get worse because there will be a pope who decides this is enough. The Pope should be in Rome. I'm moving back to Rome. And the Pope moves back to Rome and dies several months after he makes it to Rome. He doesn't die. He isn't killed. But the cardinals have to get together in Rome and choose a new Pope. And a mob gathers around where the bishops are meeting to elect the new Pope and starts shouting that they had better elect an Italian Pope or a man from Rome, which the cardinals, quite fearful that the mob could kill them if they made the wrong move, will nominate and put into place a Roman for the papacy, and then the bishops will get out of town as quickly as possible. And they will go back to Avignon and insist that guy that we just elected Pope in Italy, we did so under duress. It doesn't count. We're naming a new Pope. And they name a Frenchman as the Pope. And the church now has two popes. One won't give up the other. They start arguing back and forth. They start excommunicating whoever is following the Roman Pope. The Pope in France excommunicates those people. Whoever is following the French Pope, the Pope in Rome excommunicates those people. It is broken down directly along the lines of the 100 Years' War, because the British king is going to support the Pope in Rome. It is a horrible embarrassment and a disaster. And the decision in 1409 is that they are going to fix it by having a conference in Pisa, city in northern Italian peninsula, and they elect a new pope. And they tell the other two popes they have to step down, and the other two popes will not. So now the church has three popes running around, arguing with each other, excommunicating the followers, and there is quite a bit of violence going on. So these religious problems, these military problems, these health problems, these rebellion problems, Europe changes drastically. There's also going to be a handful of other things happening in Europe at the time that's going to force those changes. And one is a little bit of technology, the firearm, guns. Guns make it into Europe at the very end of the 14th century, 1400. We see cannons. The 100 Years' War is we still start seeing people using cannons in the war. And then they develop a way to make handheld firearms, guns. And I'll go into that story more in class. But all of a sudden, armies are going from highly trained knights and highly trained archers, because to be a good archer, it takes a full lifetime of, of training. To fire a gun, you can teach someone to do it in a couple hours. And then they can go and mass those weapons and shoot. Now, they are single shot weapons. They are not at all accurate. But if you mass enough people and fire them off all in the same time, it is disastrous for the side that's fighting you. So this is the moment at which we see the knights in shining armor come up against guys with guns. And the guys with guns win. But it means that the shapes of armies change. It means that you no longer have the knight and the fiefdom that is, the knight can make his own, buy his own armor and everything. All of a sudden, now you've got to have a structure that can invest in these firearms and buy the materials and create them. And a little kingdom cannot do that. And so these larger massed armies with this advanced technology is going to change the royal bureaucracy. That nobody now can afford an army except for someone at the very top, a king. And it's going to cost more money. And what's going to happen? Taxing. And so rising of taxes is going to make things worse. And of course, warfare is going to disrupt trade networks too. War is going to force people to try to skirt around it in order to do their trading. It's going to really upset everything. So the the fairly the very crazy crisis in the church with the Great Schism, that will be settled in 1415 by the Council of Constance. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund is going to call a council, and he will have all three men who have claimed to be pope brought before him, and he threatens to jail them and actually has to jail them until they renounce their position and a new pope is elected. And they get the three guys to renounce and they elect a new pope. But they also tried to put in place a council that will keep that central amount of power from the hands of the Pope. Trying to turn the Pope into a more figurehead position doesn't work. Um, it's not as strong as one would like it. Also, if you recall, I had talked about the Jews being thrown out of Europe, and that need to replace the banking system is going to be huge. The church is going to have to get rid of its ideas about loaning money so that Christians can loan money to Christians with interest. And this creates a whole new range of banks, networks, trades. This is going to be a big thing for the development of business in Europe. And we will see, excuse me, we will see in literature and other places a challenge to even the language of the church, a challenge to Latin, because until the 13th century, it was considered that only Latin was good enough for poetry and literature and scripture and da da da. And we'll have a handful of writers step up and say, no way, basta, as the Italians would say. No, we're not, we're going to write poetry, and we're going to write it in our vernacular, which is a fancy word for the language people speak. The language you grew up with is your vernacular. And they'll start writing books and poems, and uh, people will learn to read their own language and write their own language. And it is going to take a lot of the power that Latin had, and it's going to kind of turn it into, if not quite a dead language, a language that does not develop. And that is strictly used for only a handful of ceremonial purposes, such as the Mass. Although vernacular literature is going to be extended to such things as the Bible. We will see people trying to translate the Bible into their own language. We will have several movements of theologians, university theologians, who will say, let's translate the Bible and let's start preaching in the vernacular, in people's language, so they can understand what's happening in the Mass. That's going to start developing in new ways as well. So, yes, we associate the Black Death with the medieval period. It fills our imagination of it in many ways. But there is a second thing that fills our imagination of the Middle Ages, and that is the Gothic cathedral. Medieval cathedrals were the seats of the bishops. Not every church is a cathedral. A cathedral must be where a bishop holds mass or attends mass. In fact, in every cathedral there is basically a throne, a special chair set aside, and only the bishop can sit there. And it's a big deal. And it's where major ceremonies are happening. But these cathedrals were ways for cities and lords of the manor and the merchants and the guilds and the church and everybody involved to get together, raise money, and build something spectacular. And the Gothic style has all sorts of things that are unique about it. These groin arches, these pointed arches, the very vertical line of the church, the way that they can open up the walls, make the walls very fairly thin, with the weight of these arches supported by columns and pillars so that the walls can be thin and they can open up to windows uh, of stained glass, large windows of stained glass all the way around the church in many ways. And cities competed to make the biggest and the best churches. It was, an attempt to outdo their neighbors. So they were, still are, spectacular spaces that are dedicated to not just church services, they were a community um, place. The entire community went there for Mass. Um, People's lives were very tied up around these giant cathedrals. And if one had sufficient enough wealth, one was interred, buried in these churches. Most cathedrals have crypts underneath where they have buried people, or they are actually interned in the walls. You will see, if you go into a cathedral, you will see various stones that are dedicated to people. Oftentimes they are interred in inside those stones. So it really has quite a bit of the community in it. It has local favored saints, uh, various chapels that are only used on certain days that are meaningful, maybe to the city, etc. And we think of Gothic, we call people Goths. We think of them as being dark hair, heavy makeup, and wearing nothing but black clothes, and they're always so emotional. Um, the Gothic cathedral, where they kind of got the name from, was never intended to be dark. It was intended to be light and airy and tall and beautiful in ways that buildings had not been beautiful that way before. We are fortunate enough in Washington, D.C. to have a Gothic cathedral. Even though it was made in the 20th century, essentially, it is in Gothic style. And it even had craftsmen from Europe, from England, from Germany, who had worked on preparing or repairing Gothic cathedrals in Europe. They were brought in to do some of the stonework. And I'll talk a lot about this in class. I love sculpture and cathedrals, and I was able to interview several of the sculptors who work at the uh, at the cathedral in Washington D.C. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. Anyway, so that is the Middle Ages in Europe in a nutshell. I have left considerable chunks of it out. Um, it is very much a formative time for the world, uh, and an interesting time. And oftentimes we have a lot of misconceptions about it. The one thing I want to leave you with is that they were not faceless peasants scrounging around in the dirt. They were people who were clever, who were inventive, who brought a passion and an intelligence to their work, and they were sufficiently crafted enough to create magnificent things that are still around today and still valuable today. So uh, I look forward to discussing some more of these details in class with you. Take care.